Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. I'm sure that as the thing progresses, we'll have more people joining us on this very, very interesting paper by Dr. Amit Suman, who teaches at Kirodimal College, Colonial Policies and Centers of Indigenous Learning in Early Modern India. Without even going to the paper, I remember reading years ago a report prepared by a British officer, I think it was Munro, who travelled in what is now Tamil Nadu, the western part of Tamil Nadu, Kongulanad as it is called, in the 1780s, 90s, I can't remember the date. And his report was that the general level of functional literacy was very high. Contrary to what we always thought of India as being a poor and illiterate country, it wasn't always so. And therefore, when I saw Dr. Amit Suman's paper, where he describes what is now Bengal, President Bengal, and what is now Uttar Pradesh, northwest provinces, how the two parallel systems. One, of course, we always taught the Guru Shishya Parampara, the ashrams and the were in full force. But of course that was limited, very elitist in that sense. Elitist in sense of community, not in terms of the income group. And also below that, those are the Sanskrit tolls, the toll, where people spent years and learned Sanskrit. At the same time, there was this very long layer of pathshalas all over. The tolls, everything was Sanskrit, the pathshalas were there were in Bengali. How functional literacy was such an important, and supported by the community. In India, education has always been a private activity. It was only with the British who nationalized education in a manner of speaking that the change happened. A lot of us know about Macaulay, mentioned this. A lot of people talk about the people who came out of the British-induced system. And British system continued for a long, first using the existing system, the Sanskrit college at Banaras, which later becomes the Sampurnanand Sanskrit Vishwavidyalaya, the Calcutta Arabic, Persian and Sanskrit colleges, and how the people studying in it. And he has tried to combine both. Dr. Suman has a lot of work on the subject. If you look at his CV, he has written lots of papers, book chapters, co-edited a book, mostly on this only, indigenous forms of education and related subjects. He has just now got a fellowship Germany. The German Historical Institute of London has invited him to spend 2 months there. He'll be going there. So let me not take further time, and I'll request Dr. Suman to speak for about 25-30 minutes, half an hour, present his things, and then I hope then we'll have a very lively discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Director Dr. Sri Shakti Sinha ji, the office staff of NMML, and all of you present here. My paper is basically based on colonial policies and centers of indigenous learning in early modern India. I have used the term early modern India to describe the period from 1765 to 1860s mostly. But I've tried to cover up in this paper up till 1882 Hunter Commission, because according to my research, Hunter Commission is the benchmark period from where modern education starts in India. Although 1857 was the year when 3 universities came into existence, but lately after the textbook discourse of 1860s and 70s, and coming off of Hunter Commission was largely a benchmark to describe the modern education in a modern sense. So, sources which I have used for this paper is largely archival sources from different archives of different archives of India, and also the secondary sources on the subject. Education or acquisition of worthwhile knowledge is one of the most precious and contested trains of social life. It lies at the heart of cultural, material, and social reproductive processes of a society. To educate children in the recognized values and knowledge of society thus become a vital and central concern of all around. For the colonial government, education was used to construct a society most beneficial for the working of the empire in the grab of bringing about modernity to a barbarian civilization. This was the civilizational agenda of colonial empire, or what is popularly called the white man's burden. The significance of education system for the colonial government was not necessarily immediate mass contact. Instead, it was its uses as entry point into collective consciousness that mattered for making inroads into the power. The story of modern education is indeed the story of domination and resistance, with the new vision of social reproduction seeking to replace established ones. According to Neeta Kumar's recent work, the educational history of modern India can be read either as a declaration or as a practice, which means the experience of education. In both the cases, the emergent narratives are dissimilar. The first narrative is based on the focus made by most educators and ideologues in modern India, having carried out their educational ventures on the premise that children are either passive recipients of certain knowledge or an unknown and insignificant quantity. For Kumar, scholars, by concentrating on the intentions and declarations of educationists, seems to err by assuming the same. On the other hand, the body of work focusing on only the experience of students of a particular institution, placing greater emphasis on their agency, may run the risk of being too abstract. Both narratives, when brought into the public discourse individually, are incomplete and do not fulfill the purpose of complete study of indigenous education in early modern India. The focus of this paper is on the educational history of Bengal Presidency and the northwestern provinces, specifically of the occupational groups of Pandits, Maulvis, and associated leaders of the indigenous society, the challenges to their educational ventures, and their responses to such challenges and threats, all interwoven in the period of late 18th and 19th centuries. Before delving into that, however, it is important to delineate and understand the kind of educational institution which existed in the immediate pre-British period. Until the 19th century, questions regarding what constituted knowledge, what were the best techniques of its transmission, and what was essential for a society to do with its children were not regarded as the monopoly of any of one agency. In most of Europe, it was the statehood that took over the role of a monopolistic agency that controlled the definition and dissemination of knowledge, rendering local truths and ways of life progressively marginal. The colonial state in India did the same as the new modern state, wherein from being an agency of the home, the indigenous institutions under colonialism became an agency of the state. According to Chris Bailey, when the British arrived in India, education was best described as a plurality, but one of the outcomes of the conflict between an alien ideology and religion was a loosening of traditional controls, which itself led to the plurality of heterodoxies. According to William Adam, the famous British administrator responsible for bringing out 3 reports based on a survey of indigenous educational institutions in Bengal Presidency in 1835, 36, and 38, by the time the British arrived, schools represented a plural culture, which each separate institution organizing its own separate classes of institutions without any link or relation of any kind between them, each catering to a distinct class or community. It is important to define here the meaning of indigenous. The term is used to define all such educational institutions that cater to indigenous masses, taught the indigenous, which is pre-British syllabus, had mostly Indian or native teachers, and were patronized by the local elites initially. However, soon the colonial masters begin to fund those institutions and assume their patronage, subsequently changing their structure. The indigenous system of education in India had evolved over the centuries. It was well established in Bengal prior to the introduction of Western system of education and administration during the colonial period. P.L. Rawat claims that it was due to the challenge of Buddhist monastic education that Hindu Brahmins began to establish educational institutions, that places of worship also begin to function as schools, and that Hindu kings started endowing such institutions to encourage the spread of education. Broadly, there were 5 types of educational institutions during the pre-British time, which was Sanskrit tolls and Arabic madrasas for higher education, the Pathshalas and Maktabs, and Pathshalas being the secular institution for vernacular education for the masses. For elementary education, and additionally the Farsi, which is Persian, schools for imparting training in Farsi language and literature, because Farsi, which is Persian, was the court language during the Mughal rule and early part of British rule in India. For British colonial official, all these were sacred classes of institution without any link or relation of any kind between them, each catering to a distinct class and community. In the tolls, exclusive use of Sanskrit learning was in many ways instrumental in consolidating the hegemony of Brahmins over Hindu society. In Bengal, Smriti and Nyaya were the two favorite subjects for specialization. The importance of orality in Brahminical culture and Brahminical system of education is significant. In fact, according to Megatithi, the first Bengali interpreter of Manusmriti, the etymological meaning of the word adhyana or study is to utter or recite a word, and hence here it is two. It is no wonder that the institutions of Sanskrit learning in Bengal were called tolls rather than chatuspati, which literally means institutions for studying four Vedas. The Brahminical system of education had its social goal apart from the spiritual upliftment of learners. In a way, this system was instrumental in preserving the traditional social structure as it legitimized caste hierarchy and also the society. The monopoly of Brahmins in this system gave them the leverage to gain ideological control. Their monopoly over knowledge helped them become the natural leaders in rural society. Pramesh Acharya remarks that as custodians of dharma, the Brahmins were the interpreters of religious and social customs and law. The lower caste were not allowed to participate in the system of higher learning, as that would have posed a challenge to Brahmins in their monopoly over knowledge. Most importantly, this system of Sanskrit learning received patronage from the native elites. This was important to keep intact the social hierarchy and exploration of surplus by the higher classes. The Pathshalas in Bengal imparted training in the basic skills ordinary people would require in their lives. Organized and managed by teachers, they were financially supported by the clientele who usually belonged to the lower orders of prevailing hierarchical society. The Brahmin teachers and students as a caste groups were not all concerned with the Pathshala system of education. On the other hand, non-Brahmins had a stake in the system as they did not have any other formal avenues of education. The mass base of Pathshala was strong, yet it was not beyond the prevailing Brahminical influence over the society. The Pathshala system of education, in a way, achieved its goal by training its learners to perform their respective caste duties according to the injunctions laid down in the Smriti. As such, it did not develop any alternative ideology of education. While Sanskrit manuscripts were the mainstay in the tolls, Bengali manuscripts predominated in the Pathshalas. Thus, the vernacular character of the learners were invariably the medium of instruction and the only language to be taught. Thus, before the introduction of Western pattern of education, an indigenous system of education was effectively working in Bengal and northwestern provinces. There were different formal and informal avenues of education without any link between them. It was a decentralized system in the true sense of term. There was neither any direct state control nor any centralized administrative structure to monitor the system. The system served the practical needs of daily life. Brahmins acquired their professional skill as teachers and religious preachers through the systems of Sanskrit learning, while the Pathshala provided the lower caste with training in the basic skills of reading, writing, arithmetic, and also professional training in different types of accounts keeping and maintaining land records. To gain power, the colonial masses sought knowledge. In 1779, as Michael Fisher noted, an East India Company official argued for the I'm quoting him, the utility of collecting every possible information respecting the disposition, genius, talents, character, connections, views, interests, revenues, military strength, and even domestic history of those princes and people with whose affairs our own happen to be interwoven. Chris Bailey catalogs the members of white social stratum engaged in transmitting knowledge as intelligence to the British. He further argues that the process was similar to the way they used to inform the Mughal emperors. Subsequently, these informers found themselves relatively bypassed by the British, began to develop their own more formalized system using their own personnel. Eventually, the state began to centralize education for the purpose of administrative efficiency, but it was done as a gradual process depending on the ideological motivations behind public policy. An example of a gradual process of centralization of education in the colonial policies regarding the Pathshala in the latter part of 19th century. In the first half of the 19th century, the Bengal government was concerned more with promoting higher education than elementary education and did not get involved in the working of Pathshalas. It was with the promulgation of Education Dispatch of 1854 and that the situation changed. The dispatch urged that increased attention should be given to vernacular school of elementary education, including the indigenous schools, and also which were existing throughout the country. Consequently, the government decided to use the Pathshalas for developing a general system of education. This was done not only because Pathshalas were widespread, but also because they were cheap and popular. Most of the measures taken henceforth were focused on providing the guru, which is a teacher, with training and directing him as to how he could run a Pathshala in a more proper and efficient manner. The first government attempt aimed at establishing authority over the Pathshalas was through the introduction of circle schools. Started in 1855 under Henry Boudreau, Inspector of Schools for East Bengal. This system had the provision that 3 or 4 Pathshalas would be selected to constitute a circle where a government pandit would be appointed on a fixed salary of rupees 15 per month. The pandit's job primarily was to visit these Pathshalas 2 days a week in rotation and induce the teacher, which is gurus, to adopt an improved course of instruction. A monthly reward ranging from rupees 1 to 2 was also provided for the gurus in order to secure their cooperation in this scheme. Step further was taken when the Lieutenant Governor J.P. Grant proposed a new scheme of primary education on 19th October 1860, according to which the Education Department was required to first identify existing village Pathshalas of every district, from which some would be selected by the Inspector of Schools for eventual improvement. The gurus of these selected Pathshalas would be induced to submit to periodic inspection as a result of payment of rewards in cash. Grant's scheme thus aimed at improving the education in Pathshalas through improving the gurus, even though there was no provision for their formal training. The present paper is premised on how historical actors, drawing from diversity of resources available to them, strove for constructing an authoritative site of knowledge production. In this way, group of Pandits and Maulavis, for example, can be seen as engaging with the representation of Western knowledge as a part of the process of producing specific version of Indian knowledge, while constantly redefining their own roles in cultural production, social interactions, education, and religious practice and governance. The institutional apparatus which actors were located, for instance, the Sanskrit College at Banaras and Calcutta, as well as Calcutta Madrasa and Hooghly Madrasa, are presented as not only always instrumental in the process of such self-fashioning, but also as being always remade in these interactions. Thus, the group of individuals and institutions are not stagnant in historical processes, but also understood as constantly playing a role in their own becoming. The process of institutionalizing of indigenous education and colonial policies regarding the same has tried to trace the state of indigenous education at the advent of British rule and the subsequent policies. It would begin by looking at learning in the later Mughal rule by discussing the roles played by indigenous institutions such as tolls, pathshalas, maktabs, and madrasas. It would also trace this subtle link that existed in pre-British administrative machinery and that of the early colonial period, particularly the role played by Hindu elites such as those belonging to caste groups as the Khatris and Kayasths, who clerical skills acquired during the later Mughal period ensured their hold over such jobs in early colonial era, as well as those of the Brahmins and traditional gurus who continued to remain the backbone of colonial education policy at the village level. The indigenous system of elementary schools was crucial to the social economy at the village level because their adaptability to local environment and the vitality and popularity they earned by centuries of existence. However, in the beginning of the 19th century, this system was fast degrading because of its neglect by the colonial government. Yet, there were certain ideologues, particularly those belonging to the Clapham sect. This was one of the popular sects of Christian missionaries of early 19th century, who argued in favor of government interventions in education. Even though this was done in a strong evangelical zeal, the idea was to bring the Bible to the people, that is to teach the Bible in the language of the natives. Their efforts ultimately led to the funding of few British-sponsored Persian and Sanskrit colleges that would be suitable for British administrative purposes. The system of indigenous education still remained neglected by the colonial government. This paper focuses on how the indigenous schools gained the attention of the colonial government gradually. Up till 1813, the East India Company followed a policy of religious neutrality and emphasis on Oriental learning as stated earlier. This was the year when the Charter Act of 1813 announced and the release of large amount of money annually for educational activities, which was 1 lakh per annum. This was also the year when the Christian missionaries were allowed to propagate their religion based on the assumptions that the Indians were primarily an ignorant lot needing introduction to a proper religion. The time period between 1813 and 1833 was one of that was raised with controversies between the Anglicist and the Orientalist groups, each vying to have the government spend the public money on English education or Oriental learning respectively. The first serious step taken towards the improvement of education in the presidency of Bengal was the conduct of surveys and subsequent reports prepared by William Adam as mentioned above. The colonial government defined traditional institutions of learning such as tolls and maktabs as not being very sound because of their inefficiency in English medium. As a teacher in a traditional educational institution would not have a prospect of teaching in a university because of his inability to converse in English, leading to an isolation of such institutions. The paper outlines how it was not only 1835 that the colonial government began to make some interventions in vernacular indigenous education. T.B. Macaulay, Thomas Wellington Macaulay I'm talking about, in his famous minute in the same year, which is 1835, had asserted that the aim of government as far as educational policy was concerned to create a class of people who would act as interpreters between them and the people they governed. Thus, education for the masses still remained as a far-fetched idea. For now, the educated Indians would in turn educate the masses in application of the downward filtration theory. This is one of the famous policies which the colonial government had, where they are supposed to educate the upper elites of the society, and the upper elites were supposed to educate downwards. It was also aimed at raising the moral character of the Indians to suit the colonial administrative machinery, that is to bring about greater efficiency in all branches of administration by enabling the government to obtain the services of intelligent and trustworthy persons in every department of the government. It was in 1854 that the colonial government's role in framing an educational policy for India was asserted through famous Wood's dispatch. This dispatch suggested the creation of an education department, the establishment of universities, and the creation of a network of graded schools all over the India, and also the introduction of grant in aid. This dispatch also talked about arrangement for teachers training, the maintenance of proper relationship between education and employment, and the expansion of female education. This dispatch, although promised a lot on paper, but it will be seen subsequently whether these policies framed under it were implemented properly. The main burden of vernacular education in Bengal thus fell on the proprietors of land rather than on the imperial revenues. Thus, making the entire objective of the responsibility of colonial government towards their subject redundant. Yet this policy of keeping intact indigenous knowledge could not be continued for a long time. Soon, many colonial administrators began to challenge such a view and argued instead for Anglicist knowledge formation. The indigenous institutions were medieval institutions, they argued, and they were redundant in playing a valuable role in educating the society in modern times. Instead, the knowledge of English and Western sciences was seen as the most important aspect of acquiring Western knowledge. English had become the language of administration in late 1830s, and therefore it had become important to teach that language to the natives in order to create a pool of cheap labor in the lower clerical order. This was done in the grab of improving the moral grounds of the natives. In his well-known statement, Charles Grant has painted a highly critical picture of depressing state of vernacular education and public morals in Bengal, and the suggestion he made was to introduce English education through a network of schools to transmit knowledge of Western science and literature to the natives. Grant was clearly not in favor of imparting such knowledge through the vernaculars, was strongly inclined towards imparting such knowledge by the medium of English. This stand of thought went a long way in shaping the educational policies of British from the early decades of 19th century onwards. It underlined forever the backwardness of the Oriental, in this case, Indian intellectual traditions, was a move toward justification of empire. By just exposing Western knowledge with modernity, it assumed that character of superior culture. All that the Western knowledge espoused, including its liberal ideas, were conceived as a modern, consequently, its implant in the native society was seen as a benevolent act by the masters. This went a long way in shaping British policy regarding education. Immense changes were brought about in the structure of indigenous educational institutions after colonial intervention. Most importantly, it created new kinds of division in the educational setup. For instance, along with the already existing madrasas and pathshalas, teaching the vernacular, and here though untouched by the government, the latter created new institutions of vernacular education such as Calcutta Madrasa and Banaras Sanskrit College. By introducing an English department in the institutions imparting English education, the colonial government created front lines within the educational system with deep political and social repercussions. H.T. Prinsep, an English civil servant, asserted that a study of Arabic and Persian was only fit for producing Qazis and Maulvis. According to Prinsep, modern and scientific study was possible only through the spread of English education and modern Western sciences. As a result, an English department was constituted in the Calcutta Madrasa in 1853, even though it invited lesser students than the Arabic department. Due to the bleak response of number of students in the English department, the reason given was that unlike the Hindu population, the local Muslim population considered a study of Arabic literature far superior than a study of English. Subsequently, an Anglo-Persian department was opened at the Calcutta Madrasa. This in some ways explained the lagging behind of Muslim population in gaining better employment opportunities under the colonial government from 19th centuries onward. The Calcutta Madrasa thus had begun in 1780s by following the Dars-e-Nizamiya, the famous madrasa of 18th century Baghdad. A decade later, major reforms in madrasa education was considered necessarily, introducing among other things a change in the curriculum. In the 1850s, the madrasa was divided into two separate departments, the Arabic or senior department and Anglo-Persian or junior department. The latter modeled on the Anglo-vernacular government schools. However, the efforts to reform the indigenous institution were characterized with much ambiguity due to uncertainties about the utility of Oriental learning and doubts that drastic measures of reforms might provoke a hostile reaction on the part of Muslims. As mentioned in this paper, there was already resistance to radical reforms from local Muslim populations, especially during the time of 1857 Great Mutiny or the revolt of 1857. Calcutta Madrasa was transformed into a barrack for the British Army, and local elites urged to the government that you don't convert a madrasa to a barrack, because our sons are going to that institution and their studies would be hampered. Thus, division between vernacular and Anglo-vernacular institutions were created. The institutions that were created or funded by the government introduced English as an important subject of study, while the ones that were left untouched continued imparting knowledge in the vernaculars, creating a class division between the students attending them. When I was doing research at the National Archives of India, I found a register of schools where every student who were getting admitted to the school, they were supposed to write their caste. This was the part of the curriculum. Admission process. Gradually, a sharp divide between indigenous and Western knowledge, its social consequences began to emerge in terms of employability, social status, and political influence. The government also brought in changes in organizational structure of the indigenous institution that it influenced. The schools were divided into primary, middle, and high school levels. For further studies, it introduced the system of colleges and university. Within the school itself, academic levels such as first standard, second standard, and so on was created. For a population conditioned by the Pathshala, Toll, Madrasa, Maktab system, the strong hierarchical structure was entirely new and also resulted in some kind of resistance from the local population, as seen in the case of Muslims in Calcutta. The promotion to the next class, reflecting the academic success or progress of student, was based on merit acquired through an examination system. The relationship between teacher, formerly guru, and the pupil, formerly shishya, was thus formalized. The new educational system also perpetuated other divisions within the society. Segregations in organizations of school was practiced on the basis of gender and religion. Padma Anagals, through her path-breaking work on gender studies, has urged to the historians to focus on women's agency, on women requiring civil, political, and religious rights. This means recognizing at what women were saying, writing, and doing in relation to dominant discourses in the society. We do not find the same in indigenous education institutions set up by the British. The premier indigenous institutions such as Calcutta Madrasa, Banaras Sanskrit College Calcutta, as well as Hooghly Madrasa were all for the boys. This explains the colonial government notions regarding the Indian society and their subsequent hesitation in interweaving with the Indian customs and traditions. It is also demonstrative of how the colonial administrators, the men of enlightenment, were not entirely modern despite their claims, though the colonial institution did eventually provide agency to women in 19th century. Similarly, the idea of Indian society being fragmented along religious lines was deeply entrenched in the administrative psyche of the government. While in the pre-British era, both Hindus and Muslims went to study in maktabs and madrasas. Even during the Sikandar Lodi's reign, the Hindus for the first time applied themselves to the study of Persian. Moreover, according to Narendranath law, Hindus and Muslims were studying in the same schools and colleges during the time of Akbar. College not in a modern sense, obviously. Several works of Sanskrit were also rendered into Persian, such as Mahabharata, which is Ramayana. Thus, Hindus also studied in madrasa in order to gain better access to employment in pre-British area. One of the best examples of that was obviously the initial education of Dr. Raja Ram Mohan Roy. He took his initial education from Patna Madrasa. However, with the faulty Orientalist notion of one language for one community, meaning thereby that Sanskrit was a language of Hindus and Arabic that of Muslims, the colonial government opened separate institutions for each community. For instance, Calcutta Madrasa for Muslims and Banaras Sanskrit College for Hindus. Yet for Hooghly College, which is Hooghly Madrasa, the government of Bengal in 1872 was so keen of the need of Muslims in the educational staff that it declared its readiness to accept a somewhat lower standard of excellence in Mohammedan masters that it has recently obtained a Hindu masters. These moves contributed to the polarization of Indian society on religious lines. Categories such as Hindus and Muslims began to be part of larger discourse even as education was primarily meant for upper strata of population. The Banaras Sanskrit College, for instance, admitted the upper caste such as Pandits and Kais and European men as students, leading to a greater degree of stratification of the Indian society and a perpetuation of privileges of upper caste. In this context, Nigel Crook has very well postulated the idea of hidden curriculum. According to him, in the minds of some educators at least, the hidden curriculum was the curriculum, arguing that the exclusion was a form of social control, not only because access to the data was hereby limited, but because a hidden curriculum of caste differentiation was reinforced. The colonial policy regarding the institutions of indigenous learning were characterized with great ambivalence. But first, in the process of accumulating greater knowledge about the native society, the colonial government began to institutionalize such centers of knowledge. While in the pre-British period, the centers of learning were defined by their plurality and decentralized organizational structure, under the British, we find a process of centralization and institutionalization in the name of quality education. It was a gradual process though. In the initial period, because of lack of knowledge about educational practices in India, the government followed the pre-existing norms in terms of management, patronage, syllabus of these institutions. However, we see a process of centralization beginning with the late 18th centuries, mostly under the pretext of mismanagement of funds. For instance, in the first few years of its funding, the principal of Banaras Sanskrit College, Kashinath Sharma, along with other pundits employed with the college, were dismissed for corruption charges, having apparently appropriated the stipends paid by the company to attract students in their own personal salaries. While there was no ambiguity regarding the goal of centralization or institutionalization these centers of indigenous learning, the colonial policies regarding how the goal is to be attained were ambivalent for several reasons. One, the policy of colonial government was dominated by the ideological inclination of administrators in change, and also the debates between Orientalists and Anglicists are discussed. Questions like which institutions, vernacular or Anglo-vernacular, should public money be spent on raised in the early decades of the 19th centuries. This led to the process of neglect and adaptation in various phases of policy formation during the late 18th and first half of 19th centuries. The indigenous institutions, for instance, were first neglected by the colonial government, led to a continuation of organizational system as established during the time of their funding. However, as the Anglicists began to criticize these institutions by pointing to their degradation and moral disrepute, the attention of government was to draw it, subsequently leading to reforming particularly questions of introduction of English in these institutions. A study of these institutions is informed by not only what it was, but also what it was not. One of the important critiques of colonial policy was that there was no proper training system for the teachers. There were attempts made for improving the Pathshala at village level by J.P. Grant in 1860s, wherein from every district of Bengal, some Pathshalas would be selected by the inspector of school for eventual improvement, wherein scholars' performance is in an examination of Pathshala, subjects would determine the cash reward for the group. Grant's scheme aimed at improving education in the Pathshalas through improving the gurus. But one serious flaw was that it made no provision for the education and training of the gurus. Later, Inspector Woodrow, one of the famous school inspectors of 19th century Bengal, entrusted with the task of implementing Grant's scheme, brought in two new elements of teachers training in normal school and payment by results instead of fixing stipends. But we do not find any attempt to train teachers at higher level. This closed the windows of opportunity for those having studied in vernacular institutions to be able to teach in an Anglo-vernacular or government educational institutions. Moreover, even though the government promised modern or scientific knowledge, it failed to provide technological instructions. Undue preferences for literary instruction was one of the defective points of Machiavellian setup of English education in India. The fate of indigenous scientific works, especially those originating from the medieval era and thus termed as obsolete by the colonial government, was sealed, and Machiavelli's obsession with European literature and science. Earlier, the exchange of ideas between the Hindus and Muslims had brought to the fore many exponents of science. In the pre-British area, the Muslim rulers had successfully introduced the Islamic sciences of medicine, astronomy, geography, navigation in India, and many of them did not consider Indian literature and science as useless and absurd. Hence, exchange of scientific ideas between them followed. But the British adopted a negative approach in their educational plans towards indigenous scientific works once their rule was secure, and rejected totally Oriental literature and indigenous work of science. Thus, to conclude, the present papers offers a preliminary analysis of how colonial authority was established over cultural spaces in India, first by establishing indigenous centers of higher learning, and then by centralizing them by bringing the management under colonial authority based on the ideological undercurrent of the superiority of European civilization. Hence, there were attempts to replace personalized Indian cultural authority by institutionalizing and co-opting Indian forms of authority, leading to immense changes in the social matrix of Indian society and culture. Thank you.